Obviously, as you just heard, maybe I'll do that so it's a little bit better.
Did you hear okay? Just speak up if you can.
Okay,
We can.
you can, okay. Obviously, as you just heard, there's a video in this case. And so it's hard to imagine that we're gonna spend the next many, many hours arguing about what the facts are gonna be. I'm pretty sure we will. And I think that's because people are human. Sometimes they do the right thing, sometimes they do the wrong thing. And sometimes human perspective is just not that good. So what I wanted to do is tell you a little bit about this case. And I think I'll just try to take some of that and other pieces of that away. This case is about a prisoner. And the prisoner, like any prisoner, has done something wrong. And like all prisoners, society must be protected from people who do something wrong, and they must be put in custody. But also, prisoners must be protected. The prisoner is drunk, and he's suffering from the strong effects of pepper spray. The prisoner's eyes and nose and skin are burning with an intense pain. The intoxicated prisoner is completely blind, in a general state of misery and unhappiness. An officer with long experience on the force comes to the prisoner's aid and offers to soothe away his pain, which I'm sure felt to the prisoner like an oasis coming from a garden hose in the Sally Port area of the police station. The officer helps the prisoner blow his nose repeatedly into the prisoner's own shirt. The officer is protecting the prisoner and meeting his medical needs, taking away the effects of the pepper spray. This calms the prisoner as the pain is lessened and his immediate medical needs are being brought as that pepper spray is being soothed out of his face and his eyes, his mouth, that focuses on. The blinded prisoner is led to the station under the protection of the officer and finally comes to rest under the holding cell with help on a bench. The officer goes back to get some decontamination wipes, and as he does, the pain is coming back. He's calmly waiting. As the officer is looking for contamination wipes, they can't find any. And a different officer sees a bottle that might be water, it might not be, picks it up, places it back. Then they come to tell the prisoner that they can't find any contamination wipes. Pain has been building, and the prisoner needs something to take away the pain, and asks where the water is in the cell. The officer who has just been protecting him and helping him tells him there is no water in the cell, just toilet water. He's known that people have used it. The trust and calm that was there and put into place melts away as quickly as it was earned. Other than the toilet, the prisoner's only means of relief is a paper towel used to fan the flames of his pain and frustration. The prisoner thinks it's barbaric. No one should be deprived of water. And the thought of using toilet water angers him in his drunken and disabled state. The pain is burning. The prisoner needs to let the police know that the water is not working. Oh, sorry, I apologize. The prisoner, there's a sink in the room. And so the prisoner goes over to the sink and tries to turn it on. The pain is burning and the prisoner needs to know, let the police know that the water is not working. I'm sure that they can fix it. How does the prisoner get their attention in a holding cell? There's no intercom, there's no buzzer, there's no way to communicate his intense needs. The obvious way to get police to come help you and get more water is to yell and bang on the door, get their attention. The prisoner has no idea how the door is locked. Is it a latch? Is it a key bolt? I don't think it's anything he's thinking about. He yells and bangs on the door looking for assistance for water. sure he's thinking they can take you to another cell, bring you to some water. They can bring you back out to that hose that helped you so much in the first place. And instead of water, what happens is the officers return, not with options, but with threats and ultimatums. The prisoner at this point is restrained behind the door. The prisoner is not resisting or trying to escape. There is no threat to officers or others. He's in a holding cell. The officer or two other fellow officers wait just a few steps away, waiting for the next bang on the door. And it comes. The officer that once helped and had brought calm enters the cell with the idea to take decisive action. The prisoner is bending down his pain, and his vision is poor, and his frustration is high. And still there's no water and no help. And then the prisoner feels a tremendous strike into his chest that he has no idea is coming. And that prisoner is launched across the cell, his head striking the wall. And then as they go over to place him on the ring, a smear of blood goes across the officer's arm, which I don't believe the officer sees. Just outside the cell room door, another officer points out, there's a lot of blood in your arm. Is that my blood? Is it his blood? Go back in and check the head. The prisoner is bleeding. And as promised, they put him on the restraining ring. He's still suffering, he still has no water, he still has no assistance, and now he has no way to call for help. The prisoner is left alone in his misery with his old injuries and his new ones for 12 minutes more before someone comes and checks on him again. Finally, the prisoner is taken to the hospital and remains there for the treatment of all his injuries, old and new. That's pretty much the end of it. Obviously, we all know Rob Sanders was the officer. He did some good things, and he made mistakes. Sanders conducted a violation of 19-225-3, which is in our Code of Ordinances, and that was an improper and abusive treatment of a prisoner. He was also in violation of 103.01, his duty to use reasonable force. He was also in a violation of the need to give medical attention underneath this code. Sanders was fired for all of these things and his disciplinary record. The chief acted appropriately, and I think that you as the board, when you hear all the evidence and take all these things in, will send a strong message in support of what the chief's action will. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Noce. Mr. Jansen?
Thank you. Good morning. Mr. Jenks talked a little earlier about the burdens of your prior knowledge in this case. Luckily, there's not many of them, but I'm sure that 2 years ago, you saw the press conference and you saw 10 seconds of video. I'll bet you didn't see another thing. Ladies and gentlemen, you are not a jury, but you have a job here, and your job is to decide whether there was just cause to terminate Rob Sanders for being abusive and improperly treating a prisoner. You just heard one interesting version of the facts, but let me tell you what this case was decided on by the chief of police. 10 seconds of video. That's it. That's it. Now, the proper standard for reviewing use of force is objective reasonableness. Objective reasonableness is a constitutional standard, and within that, one has to evaluate the totality of the circumstances. Context, everything that went on. What does the officer know? When does he know it? What does he do? Why? There's more than 10 seconds of video in this case. So what will the evidence actually show? Well, the chief said that Rob was retaliatory, that the action was unnecessary, and that it was unreasonable. The totality of the circumstances will show that all of those things are false. What will it show? That on August 15, 2011, Rob Sanders, like many, many other officers on the police department, heard a fight in progress over another officer's open microphone. A vicious, vicious fight. The radio channel is clear. Everybody starts heading for it. Everybody, almost the whole shift, starts rolling towards this call because there's at least one officer they know in a serious, serious fight. Goes on for over 90 seconds, just on the radio, before anybody calls out that they have anybody else. Who do they have in custody? Kenneth Baker. Well, it turns out there's actually 2 officers fighting with this guy, and 2 officers fighting with this guy for 90 seconds. By the way, 90 seconds in a law enforcement fight is an eternity. It's usually when people get killed. Cops know that. So, 12 people start rolling. Rob Sanders gets there second. There's one guy in front of him. That guy gets there before Rob even gets there. That guy goes in the house. So what does Rob see when he comes out? He sees 3 officers taking Kenny Baker out of that house. 2 of those officers are so fatigued that it's clearly visible they were in a fight with no other. One guy is so out of breath he can't catch his breath. He's standing over holding his knees wheezing. These are fit officers. These are military. Another guy has lost part of his gun belt. It's been ripped off. This is what Rob Sanders sees when he arrives, because the totality of the circumstances start from the second he has any inkling about who Kenny Baker is. And that started when that radio call went out. It is clear to Rob that Mr. Baker has been pepper sprayed, and yet Mr. Baker is still resistant, he's still belligerent, and he's still combative. Rob sees one of the officers get bent over the back of a patrol car to be searched. He sees one of these officers put a wrist lock on this guy that would probably break a lot of people's wrists, and this guy doesn't even feel it. Well, they finally get him in the back of a patrol car. It's not Rob's car. But the 2 guys in the fight, now remember, Rob thinks there's 3, but the 2 guys who were actually in the fight, they're in no condition to transport this guy. So the 3rd officer drives it back to the PD and Rob follows him. What happens when he gets to the garage? Well, the officer tells Rob, this guy is still being belligerent and combative back in the backseat of my car. What does Rob do? Rob, the veteran, the guy who's been on the force for 18 years, says, let me talk to him. And he cuts the guy a deal. He says, look, if you'll calm down and do what we ask you to do, I'll help you wash your eyes out. Now, I defy you to find any policy that says an officer is supposed to do that, because there's none. This is a veteran officer trying to build rapport with somebody he knows is dangerous, is violent, and is continuing to be belligerent, and they've got to get him inside. So what does he do? He spends 4 minutes washing the guy's eyes out with a garden hose in the garage in exchange for his cooperation. Guy says, put it on the back of my neck. He puts it on the back of the neck. He says, runs it over my head. He runs it over his head. He says, I need to blow my nose. Rob takes his own hand, puts on his glove, and holds the guy's shirt up so he can blow his nose. Now, it's during this time that Rob notices that Mr. Baker's calling him boss. Rob knows what that means. To a police officer, that means this guy's done real time. In prison. He sees tattoos. They're not nice, clean tattoos. They're the kind of stuff you get in prison. He gets a feel of Mr. Baker's arm. This guy is stout. Drywall, construction, something. And he knows that this guy can fight. You'll hear one of the officers who was in the fight, the guy who pepper sprayed him, you know what he'll tell you? I sprayed him, he spit it out, and he kept on fighting. Dangerous, dangerous person. We don't like to admit that those people exist in the world. We'd like there to be nothing but bunnies and sunshine. But they do exist, and cops deal with them all the time. And you take into consideration the things you know about people in the way you approach them. So, finally, Rob escorts Mr. Baker into the booking area and then into holding cell number 2, I believe it is. But Mr. Baker gets aggressive again because the water doesn't work. Well, guess what? The water hasn't worked for years. Nobody seems to care. It's not Rob Sanders' fault the water doesn't work. And it's not Rob Sanders' job to find some other way for this guy to irrigate his eyes or to get relief from pepper spray. Lots of people get pepper sprayed. Water first, time and air after that. That's how you treat pepper spray. Well, Mr. Baker, that's not good enough for him. So he starts pounding on the door to the jail cell. Now, let me remind you, this is not a jail. These are holding cells. This is somewhere you stash people for a short period of time till you get them out or take them over to counter. Half the ceilings down there are drywall. That sound very secure to you? No. These doors are not massive doors. These locking mechanisms are damaged when people pound on these doors. The Columbia Police Department knows that. Well, Mr. Baker keeps pounding, and they tell him, look, the water doesn't work, sorry. I've seen people use the water out of the toilet. It's the only water I can get you right now. Because why? Well, there are no decontamination wipes in the booking room. Is that Rob Sanders' fault? No. Okay. There's a bottle of something that isn't water. Is that Rob Sanders' fault? No. Nonetheless, Mr. Baker continues to pound, and they tell him, sir, if you continue to beat on the door, we're going to have to handcuff you to that ring in the back of the cell. You know why? Because that's the policy, that's the procedure, that's the custom, that's the practice, that's the expectation of the Columbia Police Department. You bang on that cell door, you could damage those locks, and they don't tolerate it. They don't allow it. It's not a judgment call at that point in time. That's what they do. So they tell Mr. Baker, sure, if you keep it up, we're going to have to handcuff you to the ring. Well, these are veteran cops. There's 3 of them at this point. It's Rob Sanders, there's a guy named Brandon Kreitz, and there's a guy named Matt Hidlin. Brandon Kreitz is the guy who transported Mr. Baker from the house back to the PD. He's the guy who came out with them, the one who got there just before Rob. They know that Mr. Baker is going to continue to pound on that door. And he does. And so they did what is routinely done, what is expected to be done in that situation, because the Columbia Police Department knows that pounding on the door damages the door and people can hurt themselves. The evidence is and was clear that all 3 of those officers fervently believed that Mr. Baker was going to fight them to go on that ring. He continues to pound on the door, and Rob Sanders speaks to him. Mr. Baker remains belligerent. Rob tells him he'll be handcuffed to the ring and asks for his cooperation. Mr. Baker curses him and refuses to comply. Rob uses verbal judo, a technique taught to police officers to try to diffuse situations. Sir, is there anything I can say or do that will cause you to peacefully comply with my demands and have a seat at the back of the cell? Pardon my French, ladies and gentlemen. Here's the response. Fuck you. So, rather than risk another knockdown, drag-out fight with this guy, pepper spray residual effects or no, Rob enters the cell, and he did what he was trained to do. This gentleman would not comply with demand to go to the ring, so force is used. He delivers one push. You've seen the video. Does it look great? No. Is the outcome desired? No. But anytime a police officer uses force, any physical force, there's always the risk of injury. Again, I'd like to tell you that that's not the case, that there are tactics and techniques that can totally avoid somebody being injured. But when you use physical force as a police officer, there's always a risk of injury. Doesn't mean it was the intent. So what Rob does is, he goes in, well, he's done this before. Everybody's done this before. He's going to do a leg sweep on the guy to take him down. But he decides that he's too in between the toilet and the bench. He doesn't like the dimensions. Now, all this is happening very quickly. He doesn't like these dimensions. So what does he do? He wants to go in and he wants to shove Mr. Baker over on his butt so that the other guys can get in with him and they can get him handcuffed with a ring as fast as possible. Unfortunately, when Rob delivers the push, Mr. Baker goes backwards and his head does strike the wall. Now, the department's own expert in the field, the use of force instructor, the guy who sets the standard for the Columbia Police Department's use of force, will tell you Rob Sanders, when he did that, was within the policy, he was within the procedure, he was within the practice, he was within the custom, and he was within the training of the Columbia Police Department. He will also tell you that based on the force delivered, the technique used, it was not a reasonably likely outcome to expect this man to go flying back the way he did. Mr. Noce mentioned a push that Mr. Baker wasn't ready for. Sergeant Craig, the use of force instructor, will also tell you that you don't give people a chance to get ready for it. That's the point. If you give them a chance to get ready for it, what do you got? You got another fight. Now, the evidence will show you that after they got Mr. Baker handcuffed to the ring, they did notice some blood on Rob's arm. Rob says, is it mine or is it him? One of the guys says, well, I don't think it's coming from you, so they immediately go back in. Immediately go back in. And they find a small laceration on the sort of top back of Mr. Baker's head. And what do? They do exactly what the policy required them to do. They immediately call for medical assistance. There is no policy, at least at the time, there was no policy that required a police officer at the Columbia Police Department to do anything more than call for medical assistance. They don't train on first aid. They don't require you, at the time, they didn't require you to give first aid. Your job is to call for a medic, and they did that. Now, 12 minutes? Well, there's a reason for that. Because the guy who called tried to go through joint communications first, and nobody answered. Then he tried to call the station master. It took a while for the station master to answer, but finally, they were able to get a medic on the way. And that medic did come. And he got in and he checked Mr. Baker, and Mr. Baker continued to be combative and belligerent with him, and he almost walked away and didn't do anything for the guy. And internal affairs was done. 2 sergeants, a lieutenant, professional standards unit, people whose job it is to look at facts and make recommendations, compare the law and the policy and the procedure and the training to what happened. And they do an internal affairs investigation. And they look at the totality of circumstances. They look at what does Rob know. They look at Mr. Baker. They check with Sergeant Chad Craig. He's an officer at the time. He's a sergeant now. And they conclude that Rob Sanders was not in violation of the duty to use reasonable force. That it's common practice, in fact, it's expected of you to put somebody on the ring if they refuse to stop banging on the door. At that point, the question is simply, is the force too much or not? Chad Craig says, no, it's not too much. Again, desired outcome? No. But not an anticipated outcome either. The intent is to knock the guy over on his bottom and his story. Nonetheless, Rob Sanders is found guilty of that violation, as well as a violation of the duty to provide medical aid, a rule that didn't exist. There is one person who made this decision based solely on the threat of public perception. That was it. He was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. Despite what everybody else said, everybody else disagreed with him. They said, no, IA's right. There's nothing wrong with this. This is how we did business. Does it look good? No, of course not. But you got to look at more than 10 seconds of video. You got to look at the whole story. Then that person called press conference to say he fired him. Vilified him, called him a criminal. Said he was a criminal, he committed a crime. Well, you all know, even though maybe you weren't here specifically for it, but it took the judge about 5 seconds to say that was baloney at that trial.
I object to that.
It's just his opening statement, we'll clear things up later on.
The city is required to treat its employees fairly, consistently, and equitably. When the entire system which is put in place to evaluate policy violations says there's nothing wrong with this, but the decision is made based solely on public perception, there is a problem. That is not fair, that's not consistent, and it's not equitable. And I hope at the conclusion of this day that you will see that, and that you will recommend vehemently to the city manager that Rob Sanders be reinstated. He did what he was trained to do, he did it when he was trained to do it, in the manner he was trained to do it, and he was vilified for it. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the things I meant to ask before we got started is number of witnesses we're going to have today. And we've got all day, all night, we don't care as a board, just trying to get a feel for our timing here. We've got 2
I've got
witnesses.
2 witnesses, but I'll have them on direct and then I'll probably have them come back on the phone.
Okay. And Scott? what do you
I'll have
think?
about 8, some of them will be fairly short, but some will not.
You guys take all the time you need, it's no issue, just trying to get kind of feel for things. Okay, Mr. Noce, call your first witness, please.
I'm gonna go get her, Krista Schaus Jones. Okay, that's great, thank you. No, I apologize. Before I get started with Jones, I'm gonna have her sit here. I need to put into evidence a bunch of certified ordinances.
Okay.
Okay? So I'll have her sit here when she comes in.